Chapters 9 and 10 of the Maxwell Mystery by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 9. Further testimony. The next witness called was Irene Gardner. For some unaccountable reason I trembled as I saw her take the stand. There was no knowing what sort of an impression this strange girl might create, and there were certain bits of evidence which I would feel sorry to have brought out in reference to her. "Where were you between 10 and 10:30 last evening?" asked Mr. Billings. Although the tone was courteous, the question had somewhat the sound of a challenge. "On the upper balcony," replied Irene, her head held high, and her red lips curled in a haughty expression. "Which part of the balcony?" The coroner's voice was a little more gentle. "The south end of the east side." "That was where I had left her when I came downstairs at 10 o'clock. The library opened on the southern end of the west balcony. Were you there alone?" "Mr. King was with me part of the time. Also there were others in different parts of the balcony. After Mr. King left me I was alone." "Were not the others you mentioned there?" "I don't know. I could see no one from where I sat." "How long did you remain there?" "I cannot tell the exact time. When I came into the house again I was met by Mr. King, who told me what had happened, and asked me to break the news to Miss Maxwell. While sitting on the balcony alone, did you see any strangers, or anyone, around the grounds or on the driveway?" "None." "Did you stay in the same place all the time you were on the balcony, after Mr. King left you?" "No. That is, yes." "What do you mean by that answer?" "I walked a few steps back and forth." "Not around the corner into the north side?" "No. Not so far as that." As Irene made this statement her face grew ashen pale, and I thought I saw her glance in the direction of Gilbert Crane. But I was not sure of this, and I was most anxious to make all allowance for the girl, who was certainly pitiably nervous and disturbed. "You are quite sure, Miss Gardner, that you did not walk round on the north or west sides of the balcony until the time you came into the house?" "Quite certain," said Irene, but her voice was so low as scarcely to be heard, and her eyes were cast down. I didn't know what to make of her strange manner, and just then I chanced to look at Gilbert Crane. To my surprise he was equally pale and agitated in appearance. No one else seemed to notice this, so I kept my own counsel concerning it. Miss Gardner was dismissed, and the Earl of Clarendon was next called. Mr. Billings inquired rather definitely as to the title and pedigree of the English nobleman, and seemingly satisfied with the replies, he asked the witness to tell what he could of the tragedy. "I can tell very little," the Earl responded. "I was dancing with a young lady in the drawing room, when I heard Mr. Crane announce from the doorway that somebody had been shot. I realized at once that unless restrained the guests would all rush to the scene. I took the young lady who was with me to a sofa, and then I spoke to all the people at once, advising them to remain in the drawing room. I may have taken upon myself undue authority, but I did it in an endeavor to avoid a scene of confusion. After a time we all learned what had happened, and of course the guests for the most part went away at once." "Where had you been just before the dance, during which you heard the news?" "I had been on the lower veranda." "With whom?" "I was alone. I wanted to smoke a cigarette, and I strolled round the verandas toward the back of the house." "On the same side of the house as the library, upstairs?" "Yes, the same side." "Did you see any person or persons other than the guests of the house?" "No. That is, not that I could distinguish. But I saw a motor car which came swiftly up the drive, passed me, and went on round the house." "Did you notice the car especially?" "I gave it little thought, as it might have been bringing or taking guests, or might have had to do with the caterers or servants. Can you describe the car?" "Though I didn't see it clearly. It gave me the impression of being long and low, and of a grey color. Also it was going rapidly." "That would scarcely seem to indicate the motor vehicle of a caterer." "Nor do I say that it did. I have no reason to give the car any thought whatever. and I have merely a memory of the car passing me as I finished my cigarette and returned to the dancing room. I can tell you no more of it." "You didn't notice its occupants?" "No, nor could I see them distinctly. I fancy, however, there were 3 or 4 men in it. But again that is merely an impression I gained from the fleeting vision. I turned away from it even as it passed me." After a few more inquiries, the Earl was dismissed, and other witnesses followed. None was important in the sense of throwing any further light on the incidents of the evening before. The Whitings and other guests who had been in the drawing room simply repeated what was already known. The servants had heard no shots, but as they were at that time in the outer kitchen, busily engaged in preparations for supper, that was not surprising. The coachman and gardener had rooms in the barn buildings, and said they heard nothing unusual until notified of the catastrophe. There were now no more witnesses to be heard from, save the most important one of all, Mildred Leslie. Dr. Sheldon consented that she should be interviewed, but requested a delay of an hour or so. The coroner therefore announced a brief recess, and as we had all given our testimony, we were not required to remain in the drawing room with the jury and the officials. But as we were all more than anxious to be on hand to hear Mildred's statement, we did not drift far away. Gilbert Crane and I strolled on the front lawn, smoking and discussing the inquest. I was most curious to know the reason of his extraordinary hesitation on some points of his testimony, but not caring to inquire directly, I resolved to find out in a roundabout way. "What did you think of Miss Gardner's testimony?" I asked. "I think the poor girl was so agitated she did not know what she was saying," he replied somewhat shortly, as if he did not wish to dwell on the subject. But I was not to be turned from it. "It is not like Miss Gardner," I went on, "to lose her poise in an emergency. She is usually so calm and self-possessed." "I do not consider Miss Gardner's a calm temperament," said Crane. "I think she is decidedly emotional." "Emotional, yes, but she has a wonderful control over her emotions. And aside from that, she positively contradicted herself this morning. I wonder if she did walk around to the west side of the balcony and look in at the library window?" This was mere idle speculation on my part, but it had a strange effect on Gilbert Crane. "What do you mean?" he cried angrily. "Are you insinuating anything against Miss Gardner's veracity, or do you perhaps consider her implicated in the affair?" "I have no thought of Miss Gardner save such as are most honorable and loyal," I said. "But, by the way, Crane, what sort of gown did she wear last night?" "I don't know, I'm sure. I'm no authority on ladies' dress. I never notice their furbelows." Somehow the emphasis with which he said this made me think he was overdoing it, and that perhaps he was not so ignorant as he wished me to suppose. But I had no desire to antagonize him, so I dropped the discussion of Irene altogether. He was amiable enough then, and we returned to the house, chatting affably. Determined to settle a certain point, I went in search of Miss Maxwell, and found that good lady in the study with her brother. "Miss Miranda," I said without subterfuge, "what sort of a gown did Miss Gardner wear last evening?" "Irene? Why, she had on a lovely rose-colored silk gauze, a sort of pineapple material." "Was it trimmed with black spangles?" "No, Peter, it was all pink." She didn't inquire why I wished to know. Indeed, I think she scarcely realized what she was talking about, for she spoke almost automatically. I understood this, for all day she had seemed dazed and bewildered, and unable to concentrate her mind. "What is it, Peter?" asked Mr. Maxwell. "Have you learned anything new?" They were very pathetic, these 2 old people who had lost their only link to the world of youth and happiness, but the brother seemed to me especially to be pitied. Owing to his deafness, he heard nothing except what was directly addressed to him, and was naturally anxious for any sidelights on the affair. "No, sir," I replied, "nothing new. But I think we shall soon hear Miss Leslie's statement, and then we will know where to begin our work. Leave no stone unturned, my boy. Call on me for any money you may need, and spare no trouble or expense in your efforts. You're something of a detective yourself, aren't you, Peter? Can't you ferret this thing out? "I mean to try, sir," I replied, "but we have lost so much time, and there is so little evidence, I have small hope of success." "Have you any theory or suspicion?" asked Mr. Maxwell. I couldn't tell him of my finding the spangles, and I hadn't a thought of Irene that could deserve the name suspicion, but he seemed to notice my hesitation. "You needn't answer that," he said in a kind way. "Only remember this, my boy. Be careful how you proceed on suspicion, unless your proof is pretty positive. Trace your clues carefully, and don't let them mislead you." It seemed as if he must have read my thought, or had he too found some spangles? Well, at any rate, I would follow his advice, and be very careful before I let even my own thoughts doubt Irene. And now we heard the people coming down from upstairs, and all hastened back to the drawing room. Since Mildred's assertion that Philip was killed by an intruder, the district attorney had been called in, and had, of course, attended the whole inquest. He was a Mr. Edwards, and seemed to be an alert and intelligent man. Like the rest of us, he eagerly awaited the expected statement, and when the coroner rose, the general excitement, though subdued, was intense. 10. Mildred's strange story. "I will call the next witness," the coroner announced. "Miss Mildred Leslie." There was an expectant hush all over the room as Mildred came through the door, supported on one side by the white-capped nurse, and on the other by Dr. Sheldon. Edith Whiting followed, looking very anxious, and it seemed to me annoyed. I knew she thought her sister was not well enough to go through this ordeal, but I knew, too, that it must be gone through, for of course this testimony was the most important of all. Mr. Billings looked at his witness almost with consternation when he saw how weak and fragile she appeared, and he spoke in very gentle tones. "Miss Leslie," he said, "I will detain you no longer than is absolutely necessary. Will you tell, in your own words, the story of what occurred last evening in the library?" Mildred stirred uneasily in the big chair where the nurse had placed her, and grasped nervously at the hand of Miss Lathrop as she sat beside her. The nurse, the doctor, and Edith Whiting were all looking anxiously at Milly, as if afraid of her collapse. But, seeming to nerve herself with an effort, the girl began. "Phillip Maxwell and I were in the library, and had been there some time, when a man appeared." "Wait a moment, Miss Leslie," interrupted Mr. Billings. "I must ask for more details. Excuse me, but on what subjects were you and Mr. Maxwell conversing?" "Do I have to tell that?" And Milly smiled at the coroner, looking almost like her old self again. "I'm sorry to annoy you." Mr. Billings was certainly under the spell of Milly's smile. "But I must ask you to." "Well, then," and Milly pouted a little, "he was asking me to marry him." "And you said?" "Oh, I refused to. I had refused him lots of times before. He knew I didn't care for him that way." "He knew, then, that his was a hopeless suit?" "He certainly did." "Why, then, did he continue to insist upon it?" "Well, he said that he had something to tell me that would make me change my mind." "What was it?" "I don't know, I'm sure. Before he had time to tell me, that awful man came and—" Milly put her hands up to her face and swayed from side to side as her thoughts flew back to the dreadful scene. Miss Lathrop put an arm around her and offered her smelling salts, while Edith whispered to the doctor, who only shook his head. Indeed, all the members of the household sympathized with the poor little girl, suffering from shock and real illness. But the coroner and the district attorney were determined to get her story if possible. "Rest a few moments, Miss Leslie," said Mr. Billings, "and then try to continue." "It's an outrage," murmured old Mr. Maxwell. "It's a shame to torment the poor child." "But better to get it over at once," said Lord Clarendon, who was gravely listening to the proceedings of the inquest. I liked the Earl's manner. Though solicitous for Mildred's comfort, he seemed to desire that the inquiry should go on as steadily as possible toward the discovery of the truth. "Never mind the intruder at present, Miss Leslie," went on the coroner. "What did you do then?" "Nothing. I was so paralyzed with fright that I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream."
"And what did Mr. Maxwell do?"
"He seemed paralyzed, too. It seemed like minutes, but I don't suppose it was, that we three stood there, looking at each other."
"And then?"
"And then,"
Mildred gasped as if for breath, but gripping the arms of her chair tightly, she steadily went on.
"and then Philip pulled open the top drawer of the table desk, and grabbed out a pistol. He raised it to aim at the man, but at the same time he said in a low, mooning voice, 'Oh, to think he would shoot me!'"
"Then, Miss Leslie, you think Mr. Maxwell knew who shot him?"
"I think he must have known from the way he spoke. But the man was a stranger to me. He had—"
"You may describe him later. Go on with your connected story, please."
"Well, when I saw Philip take his pistol, I had a wild desire to prevent either of the men from shooting. I suppose I was almost crazed by fright, and scarcely knew what I was doing. But my only thought was to attack the man who was threatening Philip, and so I threw—"
Mildred stopped suddenly in her recital. Both nurse and doctor leaned forward to see if she were exhausted, but she was not. She seemed to have been struck by a sudden thought, and hesitating what to say next. I chanced to look at the Earl, and found him regarding Milly intently. He had a curious look on his face, and his tightly interlaced fingers were the first sign of nervousness he had shown. He did not glance my way, but kept his gaze fixed on Milly's face, as if trying to attract her attention. If so, he succeeded, for she turned slowly and looked in his direction. She gazed straight at him for a moment, and then tossed her head with a wilful little gesture peculiar to herself. Then she turned again to the coroner. "Proceed, Miss Leslie. You threw something at this intruder?"
"Yes. I thought if I could hit him I might prevent his shooting. I snatched up a heavy cut glass inkstand full of ink from the desk and threw it at him. I don't know whether it hit him or not, but the next second I picked up a bronze horse, a paper weight, from the desk and threw that at him, too."
Milly was talking rapidly, and growing very much excited. Her cheeks burned, her eyes were big and shiny, and her fingers picked nervously at the arms of her chair. Mr. Billings looked at her curiously. "You threw these heavy missiles at him?"
"Yes, I did, and it didn't take as long to do it as it does to tell it, for my hands fairly flew. I couldn't speak or make a sound, but I felt impelled to act."
"You are sure you threw these things, Miss Leslie?" And the coroner's tone was emphatically one of incredulity.
"Of course I'm sure," she declared angrily.
"And did any of these things hit him?"
"I don't know, I tell you. It's all a blur to me, the whole scene. But I remember that Philip and the man paid no attention to me, but stood with their pistols pointed at each other. Then Philip said again, in that moaning voice, 'To think he would shoot me!' And just then the man fired."
"With what result?"
"Philip fell backward, and as he fell, his pistol dropped from his hand onto the desk."
Mildred's excitement had died away, and she spoke now in a tense, low voice, and seemed to be holding herself together by a desperate effort. Her eyes had a far-away look, and she went steadily on.
"I don't know what gave me courage, for I had never so much as touched a revolver before, but I suppose I was nerved up by fright, and I picked up Philip's pistol and aimed at the man myself. With that,"
and Mildred's voice sank to a whisper,
"he turned his own pistol toward me. I heard the report, and I remember falling forward. I remember nothing more."
There was a silence as Milly stopped speaking. Everyone felt the horror of the recital. Everyone realized the mystery surrounding the crime. Who could have been desirous of killing both these young people? I glanced round at our household group. The old people, Alexander Maxwell and his sister, sat hand in hand, their heads bowed with grief. Mr. Maxwell, I felt sure, had not heard all of the evidence, but of course it would be repeated to him afterwards. And perhaps after all it were well he could be spared the harrowing details. Miss Maxwell sat with trembling lips, and though her heart was breaking, she controlled herself in her effort to be a comfort and stay to her brother. Irene Gardner was listening to Mildred with rapt attention and alert intelligence. She had not missed a word of all the inquiry, and I knew she was storing up in her memory every bit of testimony to be coldly considered afterward. Her air was judicial, and her calm impressed me unpleasantly. I admired the girl so much that I resented this calculating side of her nature which always jarred upon me. Edith Whiting and her husband were more concerned lest the occasion prove too much for Mildred's strength and nerves than they were in the outcome of the inquest. The Earl sat with his eyes on the floor now and occasionally shook his head, as if dissatisfied with his own thoughts. Gilbert Crane was very nervous, and fidgeted incessantly with his watch-chain or a lead pencil or any small object he could lay his hands on. But the coroner was continuing his questions. "Miss Leslie," he said, "you have given a very clear and coherent statement. Now, if you will describe the intruder, we will not disturb you further to-day." "I can't describe him very much, except to say that he wore motoring clothes. A big coat, a cap with a visor, and goggles which covered most of his face." "Not the lower part of his face?" "No, but his large collar was turned up and buttoned across in a way to hide his mouth and chin." "Would you recognize him if you saw him again?" "I'm sure I could not. The clothes were not peculiar in any way. Just such as all men wear motoring." "Was it a fur coat?" "No, not that kind. A sort of thick cloth, I think, of medium color, but rather light than dark." "And the cap?" "I think that was light, too, but I couldn't say for certain." "Did he wear gloves?" Mildred looked perplexed. "I can't say. I rather think he did, but my eyes rested on the pistol. It seemed to fascinate me, and I thought only of how I could prevent him from firing it." "That is all, Miss Leslie," said Mr. Billings, and Mildred was allowed to be taken back to her own room. "All? I should think it was enough. I felt as if I must get away to think things over by myself. I rushed from the room and out on the veranda, where I found a secluded corner. What sort of a story had Mildred told, and why? For the doctor had sworn she was perfectly sane and rational and quite capable of describing the affair. Why, then, did she say she threw an inkstand full of ink and a bronze horse at the intruder, when I, who had so carefully searched the room for clues, found no traces of ink? And, moreover, I especially remembered seeing that bronze horse on the desk when I first entered the library after Gilbert Crane had given the alarm. Not for a moment did I doubt Mildred's good faith in the matter. It would be too absurd to think of her making such statements if they were not true. And yet, how could they be true? How could anyone throw an inkstand full of ink, and not leave black spots somewhere? How could anyone throw a heavy bronze paper weight, and being shot a moment later, restore the bronze to its place on the table? Clearly she must be laboring under an hallucination regarding these things. Probably she so strongly desired to throw the inkstand or the horse that she really believed she did throw them. Yes, that must be it. There was no other plausible explanation of her words. End of chapters 9 and 10.